Hi guys. Today we're going to talk about the Russian Revolution, but I've got to unplug my ears first. All right, so you're going to have on Google Classroom a Google Slides on the Russian Revolution. So I'm going to turn you around so you can see it. By the way, I miss you. Let's see if I can make it so you can see it. So the Russian Revolution. So we're going to go through the timeline of it, the causes of it, and the effects of it. So the Russian Revolution was actually not just one revolution. There were two revolutions in 1917. In the end, this is going to lead to the Tsar getting kicked out and eventually murdered, and the establishment of communism in Russia, or what's going to be known as the Soviet Union. The Russian Revolution obviously didn't happen overnight. Just like the French Revolution, there were years and years and years of building to this. Russia had suffered from years of social unrest between the haves and the have-nots. But by 1905, things were really bad. The Tsar was very unpopular. Russia was losing a war against the Japanese. The Tsar was very just kind of a drip. He didn't have any charisma. People didn't want to follow him. You might remember from the video we saw that no longer was he a mystery. People could travel in a train and see him, or see photographs of him, or even see movie clips of him. And they're like, wait, he's just a regular Joe Schmo like us. But instead of being kind of this down-to-earth fella, he was kind of stuck up. He had kind of this lifestyle that people couldn't understand. He was very like, Russian peasants. Very aloof and out of touch. At the same time, they were losing this war with Japan, and there wasn't a lot of food for people to eat. Their agriculture was still backward, and people were starving to death. So this meant that most Russians were dissatisfied with the Tsar's performance. We know this from last class, from the last lesson, but this led to an event called Bloody Sunday. In January of 1905, peasants, commoners, workers from the factories, priests left their churches and marched to the Tsar's winter palace. While they were there, the Tsar's guards opened fire on these peaceful protesters. Women and children, like I said, priests and men and old people just got shot. If you ask the peasants, thousands of people were killed. If you ask the Russian government, 100 people were killed. Either way you cut it, innocent people were killed. Even though they were going to the Tsar's palace to ask him for help. Please help us have enough food to feed our kids. Please understand the plight that we're living with, the long working hours and the poor conditions in these brand new factories. They saw Nicholas II as what they called the Little Father. He was the head of the Eastern Orthodox Church, and they thought, if he just knows what our problems are, he will help us solve them. Well, after he had all these people shot, people started to really get fired up. So this obviously sparked further rioting and added fuel to the fire. Nicholas II did not want to lose power. He did not want to be the guy who ended 300 years of Romanov rule. So he agreed to some reforms. He agreed to the creation of a Duma, and you know this from last week. The Duma is a legislative body, a group of people that get to help make the laws. Nicholas II wasn't a dummy, though. He did have some rules and regulations for the Duma, and one of them was that he had veto power over it. And a second rule he had is that he could dissolve the Duma, tell them to go home whenever he wanted to, and make them send in new people. He did agree to a constitution that gave people some rights, some liberties, and for the first time, the Tsar's rule went from being an absolute monarch to being a limited monarch. The Tsar did not want to make these changes. He did not have a choice. If he didn't make those changes, he was dead meat. And for a little while, the people of Russia were appeased. Many of them were, all right, fine, it's okay. These will do for now. There were people like a guy named Vladimir Ilyich Lenin who was not satisfied. And he kept kind of protesting against the Tsar and protesting against the Tsar. And eventually the Tsar kicked him out of Russia and he found a safe haven in Germany. But for the most part, demonstrations winded down and people seemed to be satisfied. But then, as bad as life was in Russia, it got even worse because of World War I. And I know that we already know this. We've done this in 2 of our lessons on World War I and the end of World War I, and our lesson last class about early Russian leaders. But just as a reminder, when World War I came, the Russians kept losing battles. People kept dying. There was no food for the soldiers and no food for civilians. There were no supplies. There was no bullets. There was human misery, both on the front and for the people on the home front and on the front lines of the war. And it felt like the war was never going to end. World War I made everything bad in Russia become even worse. Most Russian people, by February of 1917, did not think the war was worth it, and they wanted to get out. And this was kind of the fuel for a revolution in February of 1917. In a modern calendar, it's March of 1917, but Russia was still using this old-fashioned calendar called the Julian calendar. So by March of 1917, in modern times, large-scale demonstrations broke out throughout the cities of Russia. Now, usually when these demonstrations would break out, the Tsar would say, "Okay, police, okay, soldiers, shut these demonstrations down." But by March of 1917, the soldiers no longer shut down the demonstrations. They were like, "Oh, he's fine, let him go on." And they actually joined these demonstrations. If you're the king or a president or a ruler or whatever you are, and you don't have the soldiers on your side, if the army doesn't back you up, you are dead meat. So the Tsar at this time was forced to abdicate. Abdicate means you give up power. When the Tsar stepped down, a temporary government took over. It was called the Provisional Government. The Provisional Government was led by a guy named Alexander Kerensky. The Provisional Government was divided between moderates and radicals. Kerensky was more moderate. He was like, "All right, life is bad here, but it's not terrible. I do want to make some changes to help the people, but not too many changes." He also insisted on honoring the Russian commitment to the Allies in World War I, and so the Russians stayed in World War I. The other arm of this new government was called the Bolsheviks. This was the radical part of the Provisional Government. They were made up mostly of proletariats, of the working class, of the working poor, mostly people who lived in the cities, people who had been in the factories and had the long hours and the low pay and the poor conditions. And most of them followed the ideology of Vladimir Lenin, the guy who I just told you got kicked out of Russia for being too radical. Marx is the father of communism. Lenin is going to be the first communist thought that will actually be put in place. Marx felt that history was a story of class struggle. Lenin felt history was a story of class struggle. Marx saw the struggle being between capitalists and the workers. Lenin saw the struggle between capitalists and the proletariat and the peasants. So he kind of brought more people into the fight. Marx felt that the proletariat's numbers would become so big, the poor would become so much heavier part of the society that a revolution was inevitable. Lenin said, we can't wait for the proletariat to become that big. And the proletariat isn't smart enough to lead a revolution. He wanted to train a revolutionary class to lead these revolutions throughout the countryside. Marx felt that the revolution would end with a dictatorship of the proletariat. The workers would take over for a little while, and then government would go away. We wouldn't need to have a dictatorship. Lenin said after the revolution, we have to have a communist party with leadership that's dedicated to him, that a leadership that's going to be strictly adhered to, and it was going to be one guy in charge. This led to a second revolution in 1917. Because the Russians didn't leave World War I, conditions did not get better. Now, before this, Germany, where Lenin had been hiding out, was released from their kind of bondage, and he was snuck back into Russia. So Germany released Lenin from a prison, and they helped him sneak back into Russia. They knew that one of his goals was to get Russia out of World War I. They also knew if Russia was out of World War I, that was going to help them a ton. So they were totally on board. When Lenin got to Russia, he helped them lead and organize another revolution in November or October in the old calendar. This revolution was a communist revolution or a Bolshevik revolution. Now, a lot of times you think of revolutions as being scary and, oh my gosh, bad things are happening. This was pretty much a bloodless revolution. Lenin kind of walked into Kerensky and said, hey, I'm in charge now. I'm the captain now. And Kerensky's like, okay. So Lenin took over and declared Russia a communist state. This communist state became known as the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, or the USSR. Sometimes it's just called the Soviet Union. Changes Lenin made to the Soviet Union. Lenin became a totalitarian dictator. This totalitarian dictatorship was characterized with censorship, political prisoners, terror to people who didn't fall in line. He adopted his own form of communism called Leninism, and we kind of talked about that a second ago. One of his first acts was to get Russia out of World War I by signing the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. He imposed some economic changes called the NEP, or the New Economic Policy. These were temporary capitalist reforms meant to jumpstart the economy. And he also had some limited land reform. One of the things that the peasants were most mad about is they didn't own their own land. They couldn't farm for profit. They were just basically slaves to their landowners. So he said, well, you know what we should do? When I become in charge, I'm going to take all the land and I'll divide it up amongst the peasants. And he did take the land from the rich, but he didn't give it to the peasants. Most of it he kept for the Russian government, the Soviet government himself. And this is going to lead to a civil war. So Russia's going to go from a world war from 1914 to 1917 into a 5-year-long civil war. This civil war was fought between two groups, the Reds versus the Whites. Sometimes the Reds are classified as being the communists or the Bolsheviks. The Whites are non-communist and sometimes called the Mensheviks. Now, one of the reasons the communists are going to win is because they were unified behind Lenin's leadership. They were unified behind this idea of communism. The non-communists were not unified. Some of the non-communists wanted the Tsar back. Some of the non-communists wanted democracy. Some of the non-communists, I don't know, wanted a kangaroo in charge. So the non-communists were not united around one single ideology. And that's going to lead to part of the reason that they're going to be defeated. A little known kind of historical nugget for you guys is for the very brief time, right after World War I ended, the U.S. invaded Russia, and we fought on the side of the non-communists. But pretty soon, American legislature, the Congress, became kind of sick of war, and they called those soldiers home before the Civil War really came to a halt. So we were there probably 3 or 4 months, and then the American soldiers were called back home. One of the results of this is that the Soviet Union would take over as kind of one of the leading powers of the world until its fall in 1991. And we'll talk more about the Soviet Union's leadership between 1917 and 1991 in later lessons. All right, I'll talk to you soon.